Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. We with a whole bunch of people, with a whole bunch of podcasts. This is like a late night podcast conversation is what we're doing here for anyone who's watching the video version of this. So welcome guys. Welcome Yogi and Kabeer. Welcome Sarthak. And welcome back Arjun. This is, I'm guessing, part 2 of what we've been doing across the Culture Report. And I'm excited to talk to you guys about what you've been up to in terms of how's your podcast scene been going on? I'm going to start with that. I'm going to ask everyone, how has it been being a podcast creator in the middle of a pandemic is where we should start. I think that's the core insight. A lot of our systems and way we would even do it ideally has changed. So I'll start with that. I'll start off with Sarthak actually. Sarthak, how is it being a podcast creator in the middle of a pandemic?
For the whole of India, I can say it was a problematic situation. In fact, for us also. But the thing is, the growth I have seen during the pandemic was like countless. I cannot even tell. After that, I was getting listens in lakhs. From 1,000 to lakhs, I have reached per month listens, and everything was going perfect before also. But then it gives an immense boost to my podcast. If you ask me personally about it, I think so. It was.
I'm going to ask you about how you're all stuck at home. Uske upar, everybody wanted to get more scared than they would normally get, and I want to come back to you on that one for sure. Yogi, Kabeer, how has it been for you?
It's been great, and I think pandemic बहुत अच्छा टाइम था ये स्टार्ट करने के लिए. Like everyone wanted something, and podcast एकदम perfect चीज है. आपको काम कर देता है वो, and I think ये जो पूरा पिछले जो 7-8 महीने थे उसमें कंटेंट क्रिएट करने में भी उतना ही मजा आ रहा था जितना कंज्यूम करने में आ रहा था, because everyone was काफी शांत, and podcast बस उसको कॉम्प्लीमेंट कर देता है.
Yeah, but it's really funny because I think the first conversation that happened with our producers for our podcast was actually right when the lockdown happened the last year in April 2019. And funnily, our entire pitch, and we already did have some experience in game, even in terms of audio, right? But that was very conventional radio that we came from. So, from that perspective, it was very different for us because, having a proper studio, do a proper show there for a city that's listening to you live is a very different experience than this. So, if you ask us, I think, or personally, if you ask me, that would be podcasting for me. Ki हाँ, podcasting ऐसी चीज है जो आप घर बैठ के कर सकते हो. Unlike the radio show for which you have to go to. But then in other cases, then, when the real lockdown happened, people were actually working. Even radio shows were happening out of homes. So that was the change. But then that was the difference for me personally.
I'll go to you, Arjun. I want to ask you, when you guys did the report and you ran through how millennials and Gen Z look at podcasts, not just podcasts, podcast creators, and see how they perceive them and how they're listening to them. What were the things that kind of stood out? What stood out to you just from what came out of it?
Yeah, I think one is like Sarthak mentioned and like Yogi and Kabeer mentioned, right? I think overall listenership and listening and interest in podcasts obviously gone through the roof. Many different behaviors coming out of it. I think one of the key ones I would call out is companionship, right? So a lot of people, at least as far as the result, and I'd love to hear from the podcasters here, but a lot of almost 75% plus people said that audio and podcast help them feel less lonely, right? And I think when you're at home, or if you're with a family, etc., it may be different. But if you're younger, you're in some strange city, somewhere away from friends, can't move out. It really created that, I would say, a sense of companionship, community, some connection, which was very real, very natural. And I think that is the overriding sort of emotion we've seen outside of everything else. So if I could pick one thing, it would be really that having the voice of someone with you when you're alone. I think that really drove a lot of that behavior.
No, that's an interesting point, right? What I've kind of seen, and this term keeps coming back, I call it the intimate content economy. It's almost like you're building trying to come up with as many marketing terms as possible on this one. And I keep going back to it because at most times there's a standard joke which I repeat too many times, is that when someone meets someone they follow on Instagram, they'll go take a selfie with them. If you meet a podcast, you start talking to them like you've spoken to them for years, right? And And in many ways, it's become that. Like many times I end up talking to people and it feels like they talk to me like they've known me for a long time. Like I've been speaking in their ear for a while and stuff like that. But more than anything else, what's been interesting is when I speak to some people, especially a lot of the younger audience, a lot of them turn around and say that, especially people who are even living with family are saying that I just can't meet my friends. I'm just stuck with family. I'm at least have someone in my ear who might get what I'm feeling. And that's become an interesting, like, I think that sentiment is pretty interesting to obviously there's a lot of negative there, but I think the positive is that there's some form of content giving you some form of feeling like I'm not alone in this, that, there's a lot of people more connected to that in that sense. And I think also connects to entertainment, how you want to get entertained, what you want to listen to. Like Sarthak, when I was listening to your podcast, and I don't listen to horror, like I said before.
Yeah.
छोटी से छोटी चीजें डर लगता है is generally my point. Like I'm terrible. Like I cannot watch anything. But to me, it felt almost like an audio blog, which has a horror angle to which I found as a differential to what you would normally find. A lot of horror gets a lot more produced. Will have a lot more sound. It's like individual voice in that sense. I'd love to kind of see where did that start from? How does that where did that idea kind of come from, and how did that evolve into this?
So जब मैं 7th जब मैं 9th to 10th class में था, at that time I actually started recording, but at that time I used to like upload in YouTube. I just don't realize the concept of Spotify at that time. I don't know what was RSS and everything. So after that, I started recording, but eventually my channel got hacked, and then I have to start from the zero again. So like 2 years, 150 video based. उसके बाद then I started with Spotify. जैसा कि आपने बताया 12th over हुआ, time था, तो then I started to upload on Spotify as well. And उसके बाद then growth was like काफी सही growth रही. तो ऐसे करके वो start तो like बहुत like जब मैं 12 years का था in fact. तब जब internet first time आया था, then I used to like read all these stuff, like यार सुनाना तो है यार कहानी. But उसके बाद फिर धीरे-धीरे सब कुछ like plan out हुआ.
But horror is the genre that you enjoy.
Yeah, horror is the genre जो भाई supernatural, fiction, horror, mystery is what my personal preferences are.
I was in a recent chat on one of the social audio pieces, and it was with Vikram Bhatt, and he was talking about some scary stories and stuff like that. And there is something about someone telling something that is scary, which is, I feel it's far more, and we're going back to the word intimate, right? It's far more intimate because you are almost picturing something you get more afraid. Again, like, I don't know why I was part of that, but eventually I got invited, so I went for it anyway.
Sorry, Varun, just to cut in on that, I think if you think about the way we all heard our first scary stories, it was always like from somebody, right? It was not, you don't start out watching a horror movie or, I mean, you could, but typically it is, in some boys' room night sleepover, or, somewhere on a trip somewhere.
You get told as kids, if you don't eat your food, someone will come.
The parents will scare the hell out of you.
It wasn't a person.
Sir, especially like if you are going for like a wedding or something, like cousins के साथ जब आप बैठते हो, तब you realize कि भाई बहुत सारी चीजें हुई हैं, and then your cousins were like भाई पता वहाँ पर ये हुआ था, मेरे hostel के पीछे ये है, and then हर चीज बनती जाती है. So that's what I actually want people to know कि भाई क्या हो रहा है यहाँ पर. तो वहाँ से
so you were one of the people who you were one of those people who start conversation at 3 a.m. while
exactly.
चलो सब मिलके spirits को बुलाते हैं at 3 a.m. You are that person.
I am that.
क्या fun है उसमें, क्यों बुलाए उनको?
The other side of intimacy is the fact that there is many ways people didn't feel included in what was mass media or even video content, because it also required a certain amount of production, etc. Some of it, and Yogi, Kabeer, especially the kind of content you're talking about, it's super inclusive in the sense that you're not talking about something that's an alien concept. You talk about your backgrounds, you sound very real, and it doesn't seem like you're overtly trying to project yourself as someone who has a certain kind of orientation. And I always found that to be interesting about your show. The fact that it's not about okay, let's go deep into saying what is queer culture, or what is it about being gay, but it's about saying we just two regular people who happen to be together. We're talking about our relationship. We just and that's it's so normalizing, and I think that's also another way, right? You have that in your ear. That's like, I think it kind of brings people feel like I'm not alone in this. I also understand as well. So I've thrown a lot over there. I'm going to let you add some to that.
You know what, Varun, intimate conversation की जब बात आ रही थी, तो हमारा जो पॉडकास्ट है, हमारा रिलेशनशिप जो हमारे लिसनर्स के साथ है, they call us योगी भैया, कबीर भैया, BIL, brother in law. वो we are not podcasters for them, ठीक है? बहुत सारे लोगों के लिए we are the first point of contact, queer point of contact उनकी लाइफ में, जिनके साथ वो बात कर सकते हैं. So अगर हम लोग पॉडकास्टर्स बन के उनके सामने शो को प्रेजेंट करेंगे, no one will open up to us and no one will be interested in hearing our story. So I think हम लोग बहुत क्लियर थे इस चीज को लेके कि so I remember so I call Kabeer Babba in life, ठीक है? And when we started doing the podcast, Kabeer was very apprehensive. He was like, "No, you will not call me Babba on the show." And I was like, "Listen, I'll be talking to you, and it's impossible that I'll be constantly calling you Kabeer क्योंकि वो really नहीं है मेरे लिए." So हम लोगों ने सारे वो filters हटाए, and podcasting I think वही चीज है. आप filter लगा के podcast नहीं कर पाओगे. आप fiction कर लिया तो बात और है, लेकिन ये non-fiction.
Yeah, see, I think that was the basic difference, because our podcast was extremely personal. It is obviously driven by passion, but yet again, it is about our stories. It is about two individuals, and we were very clear since the beginning that we are not representatives of anyone and any story but our own. And that's what we are limiting it to. So we're not claiming to advocate for anyone. All we're saying is that we are two, it's just as random as that. How often does it happen that two ex-RJs happen to fall in love with each other, who are of the same sex, and are willing to talk about it in Hindi? I think that's one of the reasons we feel that we are able to connect with our audiences more, because isse pehle about homosexuality, one of the things that are actually slapped back at us or anyone talking about the LGBTQ community or the culture, so to say, is that it's a very Western concept. किसी ने आज से पहले गे होते क्या हैं, क्यों होते हैं, कैसे होते हैं, इसके बारे में कभी हिंदी में बात ही नहीं करी थी. We shied away with using words like समलैंगिकता. Nothing wrong in that, but you and I both know that ये भाषा हम बोलचाल की भाषा में नहीं करते use, right? This is what was the differentiating point for us, that, and I think for our audiences as well, कि एक बार पहली बार ये जो आप real बोल रहे हैं ना, ये इसीलिए हुआ था because we talk the way we talk. We're not dramatic. We're not performing. We're just talking about our lives the way we talk to each other.
And being authentic in many ways, and that's interesting, right? Because the more authentic and raw you are in many ways, and that's been my big learning in the pandemic, right? Is that this obviously was recording in a studio. We would always look at it as like I've had at that time also thoda arguments with some of the early podcasters saying this whole studio sound, pristine sound, and I feel like nahi chalega, phone pe kar lunga. And they always give me like the horrified faces saying it should not be that way, and this is not how it's done. This is not YouTube. I've heard statements like that, right? From old school podcasters. And I was like, no, I'll figure it out. And I had a mic at home because I was experimenting with stuff at home. But the more I'm seeing is that if you pick up and you create, the rawness of it feels so much more real in the ear. Then if you add a lot of production, which also, and obviously that's a whole different category, right? And I look at for instance, what Mantra does, that's a whole different category of that's a movie. That's not even that's an audio movie. That's not even, I don't even call it a podcast. But I feel that what's interesting with this is that the more raw and authentic you are, I feel that people will connect with you better. I've got messages saying sometimes when I fumble, I let the fumble be. And they're like, we really like that fact. I'm like, it's okay, I fumbled. I make a joke out of it and move ahead. Arjun, I know that's a part of what you guys found as well, is that people like it to be a lot more authentic. And I saw the word raw somewhere in between. I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think authenticity, I think there are a few aspects to it, and something that picking up from what Yogi and Kabeer also said. And I just wanted to like read one line, because if I say it, I may not just say it the right way, but I found this really interesting, which is, close to over half, say 60% or so, or predominantly a large part of the people that we talked to said that they've sought more content from more diverse creators, right? So it is not that they're saying they sought more, like it is not just about the diversity of content. It is also about the diversity of creators, that we are looking for people who we may not have had access to earlier, or who are more like us, right? And there is that whole sense of that now we can get acceptance, whoever you are, whatever you may be, whatever your thought process is, that there is a higher level of openness possible, that we can find like-minded people, that identity is not necessarily governed by a geography or a language or anything. Many of the younger people see themselves as sort of global citizens, so to say. So they may, like, if you look at K-pop, right, which is there's no reason for Korean music to be as big as it is in our country, which has hundreds of languages or thousands of languages, right? But it is. So I think a combination of those things, authenticity, the ability to find and look for diverse voices, really, and then which leads to diverse content, and making that connection is something that really comes out as a part of it.
There's this point we spoke about earlier about fiction also in that sense. And Sarthak, I find that interesting about your content is that it doesn't feel fiction-y, even though you're telling a story. It almost feels like you said, you're the person telling me a story in my ear. Has there been a point of like, chalo, isko thoda aur reduce karte hain. Let's add a little bit more into this. Let's make it a different story, like a different voice in there. Have you been tempted to do that many times? And also like, no, but this is not what my show is, because this whole like, what is my show becomes a question I know many times. I want to understand from you, how does that work in your mind?
See, when I actually tell the story, मेरे को बहुत बार like question आता है कि is it real? Is it like a fiction or what? I just write them कि see, it is what you believe it is. You have to think. आप बोल रहे हो मेरे को कि like मैं तुम्हारी story सुना था, मैं ऐसे नहीं सुनता हूँ, then मुझे अकेला महसूस नहीं हो रहा था. तो that जो थी ना, वो तभी आएगा जब you are going to keep your listeners in a dilemma कि यार वो सच था कि नहीं था. So you have to like keep them in that loop कि भाई है कि नहीं है, and then DMI. And sometime ऐसा होता है कि okay, मुझे थोड़ा सा लोग कहेंगे कि यार थोड़ा सा मतलब it like he's acting jerk कि ये बताता नहीं है. लेकिन यार अगर मैं बता दिया तो then पूरा essence खत्म हो जाएगा उस चीज का. So मुझे तो यही लगता है. और then जैसा कि अभी अपन लोग ने बात करी, raw रखना बहुत important हो गया है. Like मैं ये नहीं चाहता उन लोगों को कि यार इतना ज्यादा हाई एंड प्रोफेशनल रख दो कि उन लोगों को मेन मेरी आवाज में ही वो हो जाए. तो मैं चाहता हूँ मेरी फुटेज इज मोर ओवर रॉ. थोड़े बहुत बैकग्राउंड में रखना पड़ता है बिकॉज जस्ट टू क्रिएट द इंटेंसिटी एंड द इफेक्ट्स दैट लाइक पीपल टॉक अबाउट, वो ज्यादा हैवी नहीं होते हैं. अगर आपने लाइक सुना होगा तो बहुत हैवी एडिटिंग नहीं होता है उस पर. ठीक ठाक थोड़ा बहुत करना पड़ता है जस्ट टू लाइक इंटेंसिफाई द मोमेंट्स. But ऐसा बहुत hardcore मैं भी नहीं करता हूँ editing.
Yeah, you mentioned your audience, right? Just now, my question है कि what kind of an audience have you realized that you have, and what has surprised you? कि okay, you thought कि these people listen to a podcast, or certain kinds of people listen to.
Okay.
I always wondered, it surprises us most times to figure out who actually listens to our podcast.
Okay, so मैं अपना सबसे पहला सरप्राइज बताता हूँ. तो पहला मेरे को like जब podcast स्टार्ट करे तो पहली बार DMs आते हैं आपको, Instagram पर आता है. तो इंस्टाग्राम में ऐसे डीएम आते हैं कि लाइक मैं तुम्हारी पॉडकास्ट अपने मेरा पूरा ऑफिस ऑडियो में लगा कर सुनता है अपने इसमें. एंड आई वाज लाइक यार ये सही है. तो उसके कभी रात को हम लाइक काम कर रहे होते हैं तो हमें कुछ तो सुनने के लिए चाहिए रहता है ऑफिस में, तो हम लोग तुम्हारी पॉडकास्ट लगा कर सुनते हैं, वो मेरी पॉडकास्ट लगा कर सुनते हैं. एंड वो सब चीजें जो है ना, लाइक ऑडियंस बहुत वाइड है यार मेरी, मतलब बहुत सही तरीके से जाती है. मतलब एक लाइक इट इज अराउंड 60 to like 48 years के लोग. इट्स सही ऑडियंस है. लाइक जो रियल डेटा है वो तो शायद अभी स्पॉटिफाई के पास ही होगा. लेकिन मेरे पास लाइक अगर मैंने हर एज ग्रुप के लोग देख लिए हैं तो मेरे लिए तो बहुत डाइवर्स लग रहा है मुझे अभी तक.
How about you guys, Yogi and Kabeer? Has anything about your audience surprised you? Saying okay,
I think
not what expected.
काफी obvious था.
Yeah, it wasn't surprising honestly, because our audiences are predominantly between 18 to 24. Yes, 55% of our audiences is male for obvious reasons, but I think there's definitely one of the surprising things that I didn't expect. I actually thought that it would they would have more share. Men would have more share, but seeing the participation in terms of audience of women and the non-binary as well, I think that's a great thing.
But I think मेरे लिए जो surprising चीज जो मुझे लगी थी, of course we keep getting messages from cities like रांची और छोटे-छोटे शहरों से हमको messages मिलते हैं, which is हाँ मैंने expect ही किया था क्योंकि मुझे लगा था कि उनके साथ ज्यादा connect कर पाऊंगा, but we are getting messages from overseas.
Yeah.
So and और मुझे सच में लगता है कि वो लोग ज्यादा इंडियन होते हैं. जब एक बार जब आप बाहर चले जाते हो तो वो काजोल बन जाते हैं कभी खुशी कभी गम के, एंड वो ज्यादा इंडियन हो जाते हैं. वी आर गेटिंग सो मेनी मैसेजेस बाहर से, कोई पता नहीं कहां से लोग हमको मैसेजेस कर रहे हैं कि ओह माय गॉड दिस इज इंडिया, इंडिया में लोग ऐसे भी बात कर रहे हैं. सो आई एम हैप्पी कि एंड आई एम ग्लैड एक्चुअली, ये सरप्राइज था मेरे लिए भी कि वो लोग जब लिखते हैं कि जब हमने जब इंडिया छोड़ा था तब इंडिया कुछ और था, एंड अगर ये पॉडकास्ट सुन के ये पॉडकास्ट अगर 1% भी इंडिया के रिफ्लेक्शन है तो it's a win-win for everyone across the globe.
So I think an overseas interest like NRIs was definitely a surprise. Yeah, I think I agree there.
And I remember Unni had shared a photograph in our internal group after their podcast went live of a beautiful handwritten note that somebody had sent them. Amazing handwriting. That's the first thing that struck me. It is like it's so beautiful. Visually, it was so nice, and I think that for a lot of people in the office, that was like one moment where we felt like, okay, this is like one of the best things we ever did, right? Because if you're getting that kind of a reaction from people out there, from people you don't expect to be listening to, maybe Spotify or a podcast, I think that really shows what the reach and the impact is.
Because this is typically a radio thing. We did get, as RJs, we did receive such handwritten letters in the past, but I wasn't expecting a Spotify podcast about our lives to receive a letter from a small town, not even a city in Maharashtra. She was so anxious that, she really didn't realize. She's like, वो मुझसे इंग्लिश में बात मैसेजेस कर रही है पहले कि आई हैव रिटन समथिंग फॉर यू एंड आई वांट टू शेयर इट. तो मैंने बोला बट तुम हिंदी में भी तो लिख सकती हो यहाँ पर, एंड शी वाज लाइक ओह आई फॉरगॉट, एंड देन शी वेंट बैक एंड रोट all of that.
And she's not from the community, she's an ally.
Yeah, she's an ally
from Maharashtra के अहमदनगर गांव, वहां से she wrote to us, and मैंने उससे एकदम से पूछा कि यूजुअली लोग जो स्ट्रेट लोग हमको सुनते हैं, मे बी आउट ऑफ क्यूरियोसिटी, यस, जानना चाहते हैं, एजुकेट करना चाहते हैं खुद को, या उनके फ्रेंड सर्कल में कोई है या उनकी फैमिली में कोई है जिसके बारे में वो जानना चाहते हैं. शी वाज लाइक नहीं, कुछ नहीं है,
मेरा कोई कनेक्शन नहीं है, मेरे दूर दूर से कोई आसपास कोई इस कम्युनिटी को बिलोंग नहीं करता, बट इट्स जस्ट, एंड आफ्टर ऑल ऑफ दैट taking the pains to actually write a handwritten letter is amazing.
I think handwritten letters are amazing. I think different levels of effort होते हैं ना. One is that person who will actually, I've always categorized them कि the people who actually respond to a podcast, there will be one set who will not respond, so okay, enjoyed, didn't know. Then the set of people who will just like, they will like a post at most. Then there'll be the people who will DM saying they liked it or something like that. Then there will be people who will DM you saying they didn't like it, who'll have a really nasty thing to say. I always put those ahead. That's a longer effort. Like, अच्छा लगा, you comment, that's a different thing. अच्छा नहीं लगा, then you commented. Like, I had someone who said, I think a recent thing, he commented on YouTube on the podcast and said that you're a terrible host. You don't know, you're so boring in this net. I was like, but problem क्या है? My honest commented and said, no, but you don't know enough of subject matter. I said, okay, fair enough, I'll do that next time. But I find that to be good. Because that's feedback I can use.
सर होता क्या है ना, दो तरीके के क्रिटिसिज्म होते हैं. देखिए सर, दो तरीके के क्रिटिसिज्म होते हैं. वन इज लाइक आप बस लाइक कमेंट कर दे रहे हो, तुम अच्छा नहीं करते, ये वो. एंड सेकंड इज अ वेरी कंस्ट्रक्टिव क्रिटिसिज्म. जो कंस्ट्रक्टिव क्रिटिसिज्म है ना, वो इंडिया में लग रहा है बहुत लैक करता है भाई. मतलब लोग कुछ भी कमेंट करते हैं, तुमने ये नहीं करा, वो नहीं करा. लाइक मेरे को एक अच्छा सा आया, मैं स्क्रीनशॉट बाद में शेयर कर दूंगा. तो उस पर लिखा हुआ था कि लाइक मैं सुन रहा था एंड मुझे इतना बकवास लगा, ये वो वर्स्ट पोस्ट है जैसा कि आप बोले. एंड देन उसके बाद मैंने लिखा, ओके सर, वी कैन लाइक फिगर दिस आउट, जस्ट टेल मी क्या इशू है. उसके बाद इसका कुछ रिस्पॉन्स नहीं आया, सो आई अगेन लाइक, बिकॉज आई वाज क्यूरियस टू नो, भाई मुझे बहुत कम हेट आता है, ठीक है, तो मैं बोले भाई क्या प्रॉब्लम हो गई, तो देन आफ्टर दैट वो पर्सन है
लोग
लाइक
डर
कि सर
जाते हैं
मुझे
तुझसे, कहाँ से हेट करेंगे?
अरे नहीं सर, देखिए ऐसा नहीं होता है कि डर जाते हैं, लेकिन जस्ट द थिंग इज कि लाइक लोगों को मोस्ट ऑफ पसंद आता है एज पर द ऑडियंस, उन लोग एंजॉय कर रहे हैं, एंड मुझे जो कमेंट्स आता है वो सही आता है। बहुत एकाध जब बहुत ज्यादा हेट आई और थोड़ा सा अच्छा कमेंट आया ना, तो हमारा फोकस जाता है, या फिर जब बहुत ज्यादा प्यार आ रहा है और एक हेट आया ना, तो उस पर सबसे ज्यादा फोकस जाता है। तो मेरे केस में ये था, एंड ही रोट लाइक ये दिस सब खराब था, एंड देन आई एक्सेप्टेड इट, हाँ ठीक है नहीं होगा, हम इम्प्रूव कर लेंगे। लेकिन वो जो सबसे पहले लिख कर भेज दिया था ना फॉर शॉर्ट में कि खत्म कर दे बकवास है, दिस इज ऑल शिट एंड ऑल दैट, पहले क्या सेंस बनता है यार, कम से कम बताओ तो क्रिएटर इंप्रूव करे, वरना मत ही बोलो, फिर अपना मुंह क्यों खोल रहे हो। वैसा वाला सीन होता है।
बट कुछ लोग ऐसे भी होते हैं कि sometimes the feedback is very very detailed. Like I remember one of my earliest feedbacks, right? There's an actual review which is still there, I think, on one of the I think I don't remember where it was, but it basically said this host uses the word I think too many times. So मैंने ना I'd started a counter in the next three, and this is like early, like fifth, sixth, seventh episode types. तो मैंने काउंटर किया था, I put a counter in every single episode. I used to call it out. Someone told me that I say I think too many times. So well, all of you will just count and see if I've said it more times or less times compared to the last episode. I stopped it after 5 episodes, but I agree with you. There's a lot of randomness, a lot of high which comes as well. Like suddenly you get a messaging hi and nothing else after. You don't know kyun hi aaya, what do they want to know. But people do feel, and I don't know this, and I don't know if that's different for regular creators who don't do a podcast, is that people feel you are a lot more approachable, because almost like, again, I'm going back to that, like you're talking to them in their ear, they're getting information about the world from you, they're getting all forms of things, and it's still there in your ear and it's kind of going in. I don't know if this is a whole different kind of creator now. I don't know if we can call ourselves a whole different kind of creator as podcasters. I don't know if that's categorized differently. I'm going to drop this on Arjun once before I come to Yogi and Kabeer. But do you guys see almost a different form of creator being categorized now? Because podcast was still traditionally called, okay, if people have done radio, the American version, right? Talk radio became podcast. But now it's a whole different version. It's almost like YouTubers are becoming podcasters. People like me who have done other things in life are becoming podcasters, and so on and so forth. So is it a different categorization now?
Tough to say. I mean, I haven't thought about categorization really, but I think there's just so many more formats than what people typically think of when they think of podcasts, right? Otherwise, if you go and just tell somebody to do a podcast, they're thinking either you just sit down somebody in a room and interview them, or you're giving some, vishesh tippani on something, right? Yeah. But if you look at the work that Sarthak is doing, now we have, music plus talk, for example, where you could create a traditional, like the way RJs curate and talk through music and shows, you can do that now. Yeah. There's obviously all the work with that Mantra is doing with Bhaskar Bose, which is almost Avengers level stuff, right? That's going on in audio. So I think the environment is very ripe for people who want to tell stories in whatever format or talk or communicate, to do it in multiple ways. This example itself, we are recording it as a podcast, but it will also go on YouTube, right? So I think those lines are blurry, and it's become, as a consumer, it's amazing because I can choose to listen or watch or read the notes or anyway, as long as I'm what you're making is interesting and meaningful to me. I think the other thing, just picking up on the fan and the feedback conversation, what we also see a lot of is listenership leading to communities, right? So people actively seek out groups or discussions or other people who listen and talk to them, or they go and will, if they only listen to your podcast, they will come and subscribe to your YouTube channel, right? They'll try and so I think it creates a ripple effect around the content itself that leads to, for example, I love meeting people who listen to for your podcast or to Amit Verma's podcast or one of the others, because you can always just pick up the conversation and talk about 10 things that happened, and it feels like it's just the two of you were in that room when that discussion was happening. So I think I don't know about categorization, but it's definitely a wide open space with a lot more to do.
So if you follow up for this, but I've gotten my prompt, I realized that I need to go for a break. So you're going to do that right away and be right back with advertising is dead. Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. We're still talking all things podcasting. I asked, there's a point we were on before this, right? And we were talking about how are we almost creating a different form of creator. And I want to bring that up, and I want to start off with you, Arjun, because our brands looking at podcast creators differently to work with, because if you put them in the same bucket as Instagrammers or YouTubers, the numbers and the metrics are so different, but also the kind of connection you have with your audience is so different, right? So how are you seeing brands interact with this? How are you seeing that kind of change?
Very early days, and something that we want to influence to push it in the right direction. So I think where we are at today is that there's a lot of interest because it's buzzy, right? Everybody is listening to a podcast or is talking about a podcast. So there is a lot of interest. I get 5 emails every day ki humko ek podcast karna hai, right? And then you dig in a little deeper, and there's really nothing beyond that. The fact that we want to do this. So I think then, on the other hand, there are brands who have done amazingly well. If you look at the work Bumble did with Is Romance Dead, I thought that was pretty cool. They made the content, right, and they understood the audience. They understood the value of creating those kind of stories. So at a metrics level or a numbers level, if you're going to count it like you would do, say, an influencer making a video, it won't make sense. I think what we tell brands is largely 3 things. One is it's about trust, because the person that is going to talk about your brand is a trusted, almost like a member of the family for the listeners, right? So whether it is, whether it's fiction, whether it is talk, whatever it is, there is a high degree of trust. So when a podcaster goes out there and says something about a brand, that carries a lot of weight and value. So you need to respect and use it in the right way. It shouldn't just be somebody reading out a slogan or a tagline, right? So how do you find the match between what your brand is and who the creator or podcaster is, who their audience is? And many cases I found that most of the sort of podcasters who are already running ads in their content do it because either they also genuinely believe in the product, or they feel that it is of value to the people who are listening because they take that responsibility. So one is about trust. Second is, and we see that even in markets like the US and UK, where we have, and a few others where we have podcast monetization completely opened up. Listeners tell us that they trust podcast advertising more than any other form of advertising out there, right? So more than print, more than TV, like anything else. So that's quite a big responsibility for the brands and for the podcasters, right? And for platforms like ourselves. I think the second challenge is, okay, you want to do it. What do you do? Are you going to find a podcast or a podcaster that is already out there? So for example, Sarthak has a podcast. Maybe Netflix has a new horror show coming, and there is some overlap there and they can work with it. Or is it that you want to create content from scratch? And if you do, are you going to do it just, I'll do 5 episodes and forget about it for the rest of my life? Or are you going to be like a hardcore podcaster who will be consistent, do your season 1, then do your season 2, then do your season 3? Because this is not about, of course, if you're a Joe Rogan, etc., it is about millions. But otherwise, it's not about millions of listeners. It's about really connecting deeply with smaller, tight-knit communities that have some kind of a common thread running through them. And those people really become your advocates or your mavens in some way, who will go out and then hopefully spread the gospel of whatever you are trying to talk about, right? So I think that's the way we talk to our brands. There is a lot of interest. We have seen some people do good stuff, but I think over the next year or so, a lot more interesting stuff will also start to happen.
You mentioned community, right? And that's something you mentioned right before we went to break as well. I want to ask Yogi and Kabeer this, is that, have you seen that as your audience has grown and more people become a part of it, and as that grows, do you almost see yourself, okay, how do I keep interacting with them to build them into a community for your show and something beyond that? And how much of that also makes you think about the content on your show? Because many times it's very easy, right? Our audiences or the community around the show is saying X and Y, we want to hear more about this. So suddenly you start catering to that, versus sometimes you'll have a thought, I want to make the show, this episode about this. So how do you balance that, and how do you kind of build a community?
Building the community, I'll share this thing with you. So we started our Instagram account. These followers the hamare, say friends, of course. And we began in January. अगस्त है और हमारे 12,000 से ज्यादा फॉलोअर्स हैं. ग्रेट. अब 2 लड़के जो ठीक दिखते हैं उनकी पिक्चर्स को लाइक करने के लिए लोग आ जाते हैं. समझ में आता है. वी हैव 3 फैन पेजेस. वी नेवर एक्सपेक्टेड कि कोई फैन पेज बनाएगा. मेरे खुद के फ्रेंड्स को लगता था तुम खुद ही ऑपरेट करते होगे ये.
Which is technically what happens in Bollywood anyway, so I don't blame them for thinking.
I know, but I'm not Bollywood and हम नहीं है actors. But तो जो listeners हैं वो खुद ही कम्युनिटी को बढ़ा भी रहे हैं और उसको इंटरैक्ट भी कर रहे हैं. A. B, of course we get a lot of these messages जहाँ पे वो चाहते हैं कि हम इस चीज के बारे में बात करें, उस चीज के बारे में बात करें. उनके बहुत सारे क्वेश्चंस होते हैं जो कि हम यूजुअली हम बहुत डिलेमा में होते हैं कि लिसन हम थेरेपिस्ट नहीं है, ना ही हम एक्सपर्ट्स हैं कि हम इस चीज को आंसर कर पाए उस तरीके से.
ना हम एक्टिविस्ट्स हैं, which is very important.
True. So we of course हम सुनते हैं उनकी बात को and we try and incorporate that in our content. And so we have just got done with our season 1 and we are starting with the season 2, and that will be a lot more about our community, and we call it STG fam, Shuddh Desi Ke fam hum bulate hain, and it will be more inclusive and we will be getting a lot more interactive, so to say.
I think what I feel about making community, I think in our cases we were a little lucky because we already were catering to a community. So there was already a formed group for which we didn't really have to work as much. But what is really helping us in this regard is that they are actually dictating the terms and actually guiding this the entire way. For example, if there is a fan page called Yogi and Kabeer ke Dohe, themselves are forming a group.
Sounds good, वैसे.
Yeah, they themselves are forming a group. That itself has about 300 followers now, which is amazing. I was like, okay, this is really weird on some level, but you wouldn't expect, but you wouldn't. I'm not posting, but we had our anniversary. We completed 7 years a couple of weeks ago, and when this happened, this other fan page reached out without us knowing at all. Reached out to other fans who actually sent him, this person who has made this account, video messages for us, wishing us for our anniversary, which was amazing. I was like, which is so. It is overwhelming to a point that that this community is driving the entire thing by themselves. We are not really, so we will not be able to take that credit. In all honesty, that's one of the reasons I'm mentioning this. That a lot of it takes great efforts to build your own community. We know that we already had a set community. It's just that we have.
Now it's growing.
Now, just for the fact that they, it's almost ironic that they feel seen via an audio podcast.
Yeah. It's actually a nice way to put it. So you're seen via an audio podcast is a great way to put it. I think what also makes it interesting is that, that's one point of motivation as well, right? If someone's actually, because someone just isn't watching your content and commenting on it straight. Someone's listening to you, taking the effort to do something, reach out. They're a lot more involved in your content, and that whenever someone's asked me saying what's the difference between an audience for a podcast versus an audience for social content, I always say that this audience is a lot more involved. They have a deeper connection because it's a part of what they're, it really connects them at a deeper level. Like I can imagine Sarthak doing like listening parties for his podcast, and people will come, they'll want to listen to it together as a community. I'm sure I'm just giving you random ideas here.
No, see, in my case होता क्या है? First of all, congratulations both of you for completing 7 years.
So sweet, thank you.
So जैसा कि आप लोग के केस में थोड़ा सा शायद डिफरेंट होता है, मेरे में एक सेगमेंट है where I take stories from like the listeners and then narrate their story. तो अब उस केस में जैसा कि आपने बताया, ऐसे आप लोग बोल देते हैं we are not experts, we don't like give some these consultancy. तो यहाँ पर कुछ लोग आ जाते हैं, मेरे यहाँ पर ना ये हुआ, I was like मेरे को नहीं पता, मेरा काम कहाँ, like मेरे उसको ये हुआ था, like मेरे को नहीं पता भाई, मैं कहानी सुना, ठीक है. So वहां पर मुझे भी देखना पड़ता है यार, एक होती है लीगल बाउंड्री, यार एक लीगल बाउंड्री होती है ना यार, हम उसको सरपास नहीं कर सकते. तो मैंने बोला हाँ भाई बहुत बुरा हुआ.
सार्थक को बुलाओ झाड़ फूक करने के लिए.
Exactly.
पुलिस का सीक्वल में सार्थक पुलिस.
या they expect कि like मैं कहीं का गुरु like I know a lot about host और like मेरे तो चाय पीने शाम को आते हैं लोग कि आजा भाई एक एनाबेल के साथ शाम को चाय है कल को उसके साथ ऐसा नहीं होता है ठीक है तो ला यार लोगों की एक्सपेक्टेशन बड़ी सही होती है तो उसके बाद मुझे बताना पड़ता है सी माय बिजनेस स्टोरी टेलिंग एंड देन कुछ लोग की स्टोरीज आती है एंड आई एम लिटरली टेलिंग यू अगर आप रात को पढ़ोगे ना एक बारी को यू कैन फ्रीक आउट बट द थिंग इज अब कुछ कुछ चीजें होती है मुझे हम कहते हैं लीगल बाउंड्रीज हम उसे सरपास नहीं कर सकते तो देन आई हैव टू लाइक डिसाइड और टफ हो जाता है यार बहुत सारे ईमेल आते हैं उसको कौन सी वाली स्टोरी सेलेक्ट करो फिर उसमें चेक करो कि भाई इसकी ये सब टर्म्स हो पा रहे हैं क्या तो सुना पाए तो अब तो बहुत सारी चीजें हो जाती है तो जो कनेक्शन बिल्ड होता है ना यार गजब का होता है मतलब कोई एफर्ट डाल के तुम्हें 4 पैराग्राफ का मेल लिख रहा हूँ उतना तो साला मैंने काउंटर मेल नहीं पढ़े मेरे कॉलेज के लेकिन इन लोगों के मुझे पढ़ने पड़ रहे हैं तो इट्स अमेजिंग फीलिंग और बहुत कनेक्शन बना रहता है बड़ा गजब का कनेक्शन है मेरे को यही चीज तो सबसे ज्यादा यूट्यूब में मैं तो यूट्यूब पे भी रहा हूँ एंड इस पे भी यूट्यूब में ऑडियंस एक बारी को डेड हो जाती है आपकी अगर आप लोगों ने नोटिस करा हो या नहीं करा हो बट यूट्यूब में ऑडियंस डेड हो सकती है यहाँ पर लोग जाते हैं और अगर आप लाइक ऑब्वियसली कंसिस्टेंसी इज द की अगर आप मेंटेन करते हो तो लाइक बहुत गजब का कनेक्शन बना रहता है तो मैंने तो बहुत सही एक्सपीरियंस करा है अभी तक का
I think, you know, difference between like you question. I don't know if you, but allow me to answer that for you.
Of course.
That you know the difference between a podcaster and or podcast content versus social media content, because in a lot of ways, social media content has now become passive. We're not really actively looking for it. It's just skimming through your timeline, and you just happen. It's a happenstance more in that case. Yeah. Whereas when it comes to our still category with that we're in podcast, still very, very appointment and active based that, hey, listen, I'm going to go and listen to you. I'm going to, so I like, for example, if I look into a podcast, I will scroll through the podcast and I'll say, okay, मेरे पास अगले 10 मिनट है, मैं 10 मिनट का कोई podcast सुनूंगा. मैं 10 मिनट के लिए ही सुन पाऊंगा. So it's very active. So whereas social media is now, because it's so intrusive, it has become intrusive. That difference will always remain. That you know, that's the beauty of audio. It's not very intrusive. It's always, you know, it's passive.
Soundtracking your lives, as we say. Sorry, go for it, Sarthak.
Yeah, no, I was just saying कि that's the exact thing I was also saying कि होता क्या है कि देखो जब हम YouTube पे बनाते हैं ना तो 10 चीजें ध्यान रखना पड़ता है यार हम सही दिख रहे हैं ना यार हम ये तो नहीं कर रहे हमें यहाँ पर एडिट करना 10 तरीके के डी रोल मारो फिर इसको पैच करो ऑडियो में लाइक हमारे पास भी 10 मिनट है आपके पास भी 10 मिनट है आपको 10 मिनट का कंटेंट सुनना है 10 मिनट ही हमारे पास है और हमने अभी रिकॉर्ड कर लिया तो वो जो ब्यूटी होती है वो जो मतलब कहना चाहिए टाइम इज मनी का जो कॉन्सेप्ट होना वो पॉडकास्ट पर बहुत ज्यादा सेट होता है काम है 10 मिनट का करो खत्म सो इट्स लाइक मेरे केस में तो थोड़ा सा हो जाता है लेकिन लाइक इन यूजुअल इट्स गुड
And we also see the reverse happening, right? Which is people turn to audio because they're done with their phones in many ways, right? Which is I'm fed up of doom scrolling throughout the night. I'm just seeing the same thing over and over again. Or there's a lot of mindfulness about screen time and just staring at just the, you know, whatever it is that your particular social media feed is throwing at you. And in many ways, people consider audio to be a lot more wholesome, healthier in some way. So it's a way to drop out of that constant scroll and visual sort of input to, you know, take a moment for yourself, close your eyes, you know, sink into whatever you're listening and take a break. And that's something that's really driving the increased consumption as well.
Okay, guys.
I remember I started listening to Varun's podcast when, so 3-4 years back, I think 3 years back.
3 years now, yeah, almost 3 years
back. So that was the point in time when, you know, I was working at a company as a copywriter. And to evolve myself, मैं कैसे उस चीज को करूंगा अगर मैं इफ आई एम नॉट मीटिंग न्यू पीपल कॉन्स्टेंटली अगर मैं उन लोगों से इंटरेक्ट नहीं कर रहा हूं तो दैट वाज माय पॉइंट इन कांटेक्ट कि अच्छा इससे ज्यादा अमेजिंग चीज क्या होगी आई एम हैंगिंग आउट विद सीईओज एंड पता नहीं इन लेवल के लोगों की बातें मैं सुन रहा हूं एंड पॉडकास्ट इतना इंटीमेट एक्सपीरियंस है मुझे सच में लगता था 1 घंटे के बाद मैंने अच्छा मैं तो अच्छे से जानता हूं यार वरुण को तो मैं अच्छे से जानता हूं उस 1 घंटे की जो वॉक करते हुए मैं पॉडकास्ट सुन रहा हूं आई थिंक जो अर्जुन ने भी बोला कि यू नो आप इतने थक चुके हो अपने फोन की तरफ देखते देखते कि अब आपको नहीं देखना डिटॉक्स सोशल मीडिया से अगर आपको करना है तो पॉडकास्ट इज द प्लेस टू बी
Yeah, it almost was like, by the way, sorry, this is a side mention, but I almost thought at once that Varun had paid Yogi because just हिसाब से ये advertise करता था मेरे सामने, सुनो advertising is dead, सुनो advertising is dead, मुझे सच्ची में लगा था वरुण ने इसको पैसे दिए हैं.
I used to message वरुण की ये अभी तक दूसरे ऐप पे आया नहीं है, ये इस ऐप के ऊपर आ चुका है, इस पे नहीं आया है.
तो मैं वापस फोन करता कि क्यों नहीं आया इस ऐप पे, then we realized हम अपलोड में कुछ प्रॉब्लम हुआ है, so me and Yogi had many of those chats.
It's the same people who are making your fan group and paying Yogi to talk about advertising instead. It's the same economy.
No, but that's actually one of the things, right? Is that
What, we are paid?
yes, that everybody's paid at some point.
Sorry, I was just kidding.
I forgot my chair thought. No, I was just saying that also the fun of being a podcaster is that I talk to because I also started to create content on YouTube and Instagram, all these places, and I realized that sometimes I still create it with this mindset कि what I'm making कि कोई आंखें बंद कर ले तो फिर भी doesn't make sense or not, right? And I feel there's something to that. Sometimes if you're creating, like a lot of the video stuff I create also, sometimes I just take it and I drop it as an episode, right, on the other podcast I host, not on this one. And because that is done organically, I just record it most times at home by myself, master it myself and put it up. But I've realized that there are a lot of, I think that's why a lot of YouTubers are also coming onto the podcast bandwagon, because they realize that suddenly I have like 1 hour worth of content. Others, for like a YouTuber to make a 10-minute video, edit that, B-roll dalo, all that stuff, as an audience, they're feeling like almost like liberated in that sense. Sarthak, you obviously, I'm sure you're thanking the fact that your YouTube channel got hacked and you lost all those videos.
Okay, like मैं इस चीज से बड़ा believe कर, yeah, मैं बहुत ज़्यादा like उस time तो बड़ा devastating था यार, 30,000 पे था, like 11th class में भी था, थोड़ा तो बुरा लग रहा था, और अब लग रहा है यार क्या सही चीज है यार, पर मजा आ गया यार, सही चला गया. और वही चीज बताए ना, ब्यूटी ऑफ द कंटेंट यहाँ पर बहुत ज्यादा सही रहता है, लोग बड़े एक्टिव रहते हैं और बहुत मतलब बहुत सही एक्सपीरियंस रहता है यहाँ पर. बस कंसिस्टेंट रहो, ये चीज तो हर प्लेटफॉर्म मांगता है, लेकिन बहुत समय से.
But consistent raho, also the point is be consistent with just communicating with your audience. Sometimes, you can actually turn to an audience and say, Abhi, I'm not in the headspace to do this. We're taking a break for some time. Audiences understand because they're so used to being so real with them. Samajh jate hain. I think that's a core part as well. Right? You can actually say that and people will understand it. And you'll also get like messages saying like I remember I took a month off after we finished 100 episodes. And most people were like very relaxed about it. And what also then lets you do is think about what else you can kind of like, which other part of the day can you program for people? Because I've always believed that podcasting can occupy every single, like how television used to have different kind of programming for morning, afternoon and night. Podcasting can have that. Like you might want to listen to something, like I listen to a lot of meditative podcasts at night before going to sleep. I know that I have stuff which is more information driven in the mornings. My afternoons are so I almost have time of day for it, which is why I create so much audio content and have multiple properties, because I think that you can tap into different audiences. Not everyone's listening to the same thing. So there is an opportunity, I think, for creators to also kind of spread out and do more and more things. And this whole concept, you only have to do one thing and do it well. जो college में भी बोलते थे pick only one thread. If you want to be an editor, be an editor. Don't try to be a cinematographer also. वो सब नहीं चलता. You can actually do all of it, I feel, is the scenario. And I think that's also coming to how everyone's creating as well, right? I mean, I want to ask all of you, what is your general process when you are creating an episode? I'll start off with you, Yogi. What's your general process?
So, I think सबसे पहले तो ये होता है कि हम किससे बात कर रहे हैं, who is that person जिससे कि मैं बात करने वाला हूँ. अगर so for example जब भी we started our podcast with a topic जो शायद हमारी community के साथ ज़्यादा लोग associate नहीं करते, we started with monogamy, ठीक है. And जहाँ तक मुझे लगा था कि शायद लोग हमारे को messages करेंगे कि listen तुम बहुत एक heteronormative ideology की तरफ जा रहे हो.
एक तो not just the fact that two boys are talking about being in love, that in itself is controversial, but we also started off with the topic called monogamy, which is in itself, in a lot of ways, utopic लगता है for a lot of people within the community. एक end of the spectrum, one end of the spectrum says that, oh, you are falling for the heteronormative standards, you're succumbing to the heteronormative standards. On one end, this is the thing. Then the other end is that, oh my God, that's so aspirational, I also want to do it.
So I think podcasting में शायद ये बहुत इजी तरीका है कि यार मैं क्या कंज्यूम करना चाहता हूँ या मैं किस बारे में जानना चाहता हूँ या प्रॉबेबली साल भर पहले मैं क्या था उस टाइम पे मैं क्या ढूंढ रहा था या when we were in the process of coming out उस टाइम पे क्या चीजें थी जो हम लोगों को जरूरत थी. So just वो उनसे एम्पैथाइज करना, उनकी जगह पे रह के देखना, and you can create that.
But I will still feel that I still feel, because of the messages that we received, right? It's very different. Like, I get the sense of this was also coming from our radio programming, right? That mornings are information heavy, nights are a little more laid back, chill. That's how your conversations have to be like. But with podcasting, even with our own, the same product is being consumed in so many different ways. For example, if someone has messaged me that, I have been listening to your podcasts on repeat. Someone said that I listen to this with my boyfriend. So it's like a thing that they do together.
Yeah.
You would have never imagined doing that for any, you do that for Netflix and chill, right?
Yeah.
You do that for content like that. But I didn't realize that our podcast could be consumed like that. Some girl or some boys messaged me saying that मेरी girlfriend मेरा दिमाग खा गई है कि तुम इनको सुनो. तो कोई अपनी माँ के साथ सुन रहा है, किसी के लिए ये इंट्रोडक्शन है उनकी माँ के लिए अबाउट होमोसेक्सुअलिटी, तो किसी के लिए वो एक रिलेशनशिप का एक it's a thing that they do together.
Yeah.
And for someone it's just a constant companion, which I'm sorry, I was just waiting to crack this joke. I really feel weird if someone says on Sarthak's work, oh my god, I don't feel alone, and I'm going to be shit scared if someone says that on this podcast.
मुझे था कि सार्थक ने बोला कि पॉडकास्ट की ऑडियंस डेड नहीं होती है, मुझे लगता है कि बहुत जल्दी इसके शो पे एक मैसेज आएगा कि मैं मर चुकी हूँ लेकिन फिर भी तुम्हारा शो सुन रही हूँ.
Oh my.
Sorry for the side jokes, but yeah.
No. Side jokes are the best kind of jokes to happen. Sarthak, what's your process? How do you work on each episode?
So, अभी आप लोग बता रहे थे मेरे को सही में मेरा बैक ऑफ द माइंड चल रहा था, यार इतना प्लानिंग करते हैं हमारे सीन में. तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आई एम अ स्टूडेंट एंड मैं अभी सीएस पढ़ रहा हूँ, तो मेरे कंपनी सेक्रेटरीज के एग्जाम्स हैं एंड प्लस ऑल दीज टर्म्स एंड आई वाज स्टडीइंग एंड ऑल. तो मेरे पास इतना एक्टिवेट प्लानिंग नहीं होता, मैं बैठ कर स्क्रिप्ट नहीं लिख सकता, मैं ये नहीं कर सकता. तो होता क्या है कि जब रात को हम सोने को जाते हैं तब आप एक बार शांति से सोचते हो कि अब कल वेडनेसडे है, टुमारो वी हैव टू अपलोड समथिंग, अब क्या करना है. तो उस टाइम पर आपका दिमाग कुछ ना कुछ काम करता है एंड व्हेन यू सेट अ डेडलाइन तब तक आपको कुछ स्टोरी स्ट्राइक कर जाता है. तो नाउ अब आपको अगर रात के 4 बजे याद आ रहा है व्हाट यू हैव टू डू, आप जग कर रिकॉर्ड करो. आज हमें ये इंटरव्यू करना था, आई थिंक टुमारो इज वेडनेसडे, कल मेरे को अपलोड करना है. तो मैंने कल के दिन सब रिकॉर्ड कर लिया था बिकॉज आज का टाइम मेरा जाने वाला है मस्त तरीके से एंड देन आई हैव टू स्टडी एंड ऑल. तो मेरे लिए कुछ फिक्स नहीं होता है कि मेरे को क्या करना है. एंड द इंस्पिरेशन दैट आई गॉट, मे बी मुझे अगर अभी मैं नरेट नहीं कर रहा हूँ लोगों की स्टोरीज, तो मुझे ही खुद से ही रियलाइज होता है कि यार शायद आज ये स्टोरी हम बना सकते हैं क्या. उसके बाद थोड़ा बहुत अगर आप रिसर्च करो तो कर सकते हैं क्या. तो क्या का आंसर अगर मिल गया बन गया कंटेंट. और फॉर्चुनेटली अभी तक क्या का आंसर मिल रहा है. तो थोड़ा सा कॉम्प्लेक्स है.
वो एक बार वो क्या का आंसर मिल गया तो you can actually create it much faster. I think that उसी में टाइम लग जाता है. You can spend your entire day thinking about what you're going to talk about, but when you actually hit record, it flows out easily. I think that's one of the best things about doing this. I've kept Arjun waiting long, but I'm going to have him come in here and say that if you look at everything across the report, and if you have to say, okay, these are things that you've learned about Gen Z and millennials as an audience for podcasts, what would you pick out of that? And what would you say that if on two ends, right? One, if I'm a podcaster today, or if I'm a brand who wants to figure a way to kind of interact with podcasters, what are the key things I should take away from these audiences? Because everyone's trying to understand, before Gen Alpha comes in, which is, I'm told, the next categorization after Gen Z, let's first understand what Gen Z and millennials are getting into.
Yeah, I think the first and most important thing is not to club them, right? I think they're two distinct generations with distinct names. Very often, and I think I mentioned this before, very often I'm talking to people, it just becomes a collective term for all people who are younger than you, right? And there's not necessarily a distinction. You think of simple things. Most Gen Zs live with their parents, or are just sort of getting out. Most millennials are independent; they have their own homes. They have probably have families, and so the influences and the attitudes and the way they consume content is very, very different, right. So there is no point of trying to think of it as one big monolith and all young people are the same.
Yeah.
There are some very interesting insights that have also come out about the differences between these two, right? Where millennials feel that it's the same generation gap thing playing out. But if you look at it from a marketer's point of view, they may all seem just like people are younger than you. But between Gen Z and millennials itself, there exists a gap that both of them perceive, right? So I think the influences, the attitudes are very different. From a creator point of view, I don't know specifically um, from a podcast lens, but at least audio, as far as audio goes, I think the trend is very clear. It's something that more and more people are leaning on or adopting and will continue to sort of do that. And given the fact that, and I think one of Yogi or Kabeer mentioned it, given the fact that it's also so portable, the fact that it's in your car, it's in, you go for it, you're vacuuming the house, you're cleaning, whatever you're doing, it can be with you. I think it's a medium that cannot be ignored in any way. And thinking about it as digital radio is probably the wrong way to go about it. Right? So as more and more sort of creators, and I think Sarthak also made a point around data, which is I love the way Yogi and Kabeer had all the stats, right? 55% of my audience is X, this, that. So there is also all of that earlier wasn't available in the days of radio, for example, when you couldn't sharpen it so much. So using the data, understanding the feedback, understanding the composition of the audience and what what trends are there in terms of what they're looking for, I think from a podcaster point of view is interesting. And thinking of these people, these different, there are enough and more niches that still have not been thought of. So there's massive opportunity. I think from a brand point of view, it's interesting how what a brand should do is very similar to what a podcaster should do, which is be consistent, have a certain level of, don't just do it for checkbox in some Excel sheet, right? Do it because you really have something to tell and stories to tell and you want to engage and build on that trust. And probably the easiest place to start for a brand is to try and find a podcast that is already out there instead of creating something for their own and working with that creator to see what happens from there, and then sort of go from there.
I thought a lot about what I always like to do this last set of questions, which are the same for everybody. And I thought it'd be good to do two questions, which everybody has to answer, including you, Arjun. I'm going to let you off the hook on this one. One is there any podcast that you listen to in recent time that you found, which you find really interesting, which is something that's been a discovery for you? And secondly, if you had to do another podcast, and Arjun, if you had to do a podcast, what would that other podcast be about? What would you want to do if there was a second one that you wanted to do? I know I just asked the question. So the first person who goes will always be why is it me first? I'll also answer this. But Yogi, Kabir, you guys want to go first?
Yeah. So मतलब मेरी तो रगों में पॉडकास्ट दौड़ता है, मुझे ऐसा लग रहा है इतने टाइम से मैं
That's the next podcast name. रगों में पॉडकास्ट दौड़ता है.
So
drama. That's his podcast.
So you were asking about कौन सा एक podcast हम usually
any recommendation of which you found recently?
So I've recently started hearing this podcast. It's done by Priyam Saha. She's a host online, अपना show host करती हैं, where she interviews people and talks about how they are feeling. So उनकी feelings के बारे में कि pandemic अभी, how are you feeling, work wise, mental health wise. So it's a very free flowing conversation, लेकिन उससे बहुत relatability उस टाइम पे हो जाता है कि अच्छा हाँ मुझे भी ऐसा फील हो रहा है. एक और पॉडकास्ट अभी करने के बारे में सोचा नहीं जा सकता, बट अगर कभी करूंगा तो डेफिनेटली आई एम अ प्लांट पेरेंट, तो मैं जरूर गार्डनिंग के अराउंड करूंगा.
हमारे घरों में देसी है, ये शुद्ध देसी घी हमारा वो है प्लांट पेरेंट. It's not at all देसी.
But actually, did you know, and it's a random aside, I once had a guest who told me he was an award-winning gardener. I didn't even know that was a thing. There is something where there
are
actual
awards for it.
There are awards. You can actually compete for what kind of a gardener you are. I don't know the details, and of course I always ask my guests saying, "What is that thing you do outside of being a podcaster, or outside of what you do in your day job?" And this person said that, and this was like he's a lead of strategy in like consultancy, and he just gardening is what he does, and that's what he wants to do. Like eventually, not just do his job, but I'm like, awards bhi hote hain. So yeah,
gardening is therapeutic. So
yes, Yogi, you can be an
There are
award-winning gardener.
Netflix shows.
I think इसके बाद
Yeah, exactly.
next thing जो search होने वाली है Google पे सर आपकी वही होने वाली है मुझे लग रहा है
अब कौन से awards?
कौन से awards हैं
Well, okay. To answer your question, I think he's my biggest source of podcast recommendations anyway, because he listens to podcasts. I am very, very news. Like my daily podcast is global news podcast, BBC by BBC. That is what I love. But apart from like basic content, I think it would be Ashton Doctor's The Habit Coach.
Yeah.
That is what I like. I really like the fact that they're very snackable. They're like quick, bite-sized, as he says. I think that's what I like. But if you ask me if I would want to do another podcast, I definitely feel that there is a dearth of, so when I used to host a show on radio, what really worked for me and what resonated with me as an individual also was talking about relationships. And now that I have opened up, which I wasn't back in the day when I was on air in Mumbai, I think now there is a definite space. I think that now that we've established, ourselves in the queer space, I think a great way to be going about it is to be talking about relationships, because that's what I really love to do about, and I love philosophy. So I think, like the agony aunt, but in the gay space. but that's just a thought.
Awesome. Sarthak?
So, okay, to be honest, I don't really listen to like any type of podcast, because sir actually होता यूँ है कि बहुत occupied चल रहा है. Like मैं खुद का recording करके नहीं कर पा रहा हूँ. Like बहुत ही occupied चल रहे हैं. Like seriously, like 30. नहीं मैं झूठ नहीं बोलूँगा. Like around like 10-12 hours का study चलता है, and then उसके बाद इधर उधर तो बहुत ज़्यादा चीजें.
वो question छोड़ दिया. So then, if you had to make another podcast, if you had the time, और क्या बनाते?
हाँ, तो मैं other than horror जरूर बनाता. Like stories ही narrate करता, लेकिन थोड़ी different stories. Maybe regarding romantic, like love, or like anything, but not mystery horror. बस अभी वो एक horror type है.
Parallel opposite. Kid stories.
Yeah, opposite. No. उतनी भी नहीं. लेकिन just थोड़े normal stories.
Arjun,
Around
I'm just wondering if somebody from Sarthak's college actually listens to this podcast, because he's talking about, studying for 12 hours and all of that. Looks like he's really trying to make a point.
I really like the fact the way he's being safe. Normal stories.
Yeah.
Normal stories.
Categorized his content as abnormal. Or paranormal, if that
paranormal.
is.
Yeah, paranormal. Yeah. Like basically college का पढ़ाई नहीं होता है. Like for the CS, उसका वो पढ़ाई थोड़ा भारी होता है.
वो दूसरा टाइप का हॉरर स्टोरी होता है कॉलेज में.
हाँ, like वो लॉ का किताब अलग ही भारी लगता है. तो
Arjun, what podcast do you host, and what do you recommend?
There's something I started listening to recently called You're Not So Smart. And it's I don't know if you've heard that, Varun, because it's not new. It's been around for some time, but basically around biases and behavior, psychology, stuff around that, and decision making largely, which I found super interesting. And if I was to do a podcast, I'd probably do a podcast about Mohanlal movies. Because I'm sure there are already hundreds out there. I should probably look for them, because there's such a big cult following. But yeah, that's probably the one thing that I would feel I can speak definitively about.
Yeah, whenever we speak about this, I'm like, I have so many people who message me saying, "Why don't you do a Telugu podcast?" I'm like, it's an idea at the back of my head. I will do a Telugu podcast one day. And then suddenly someone in the family writes to me from the US saying, "You should do it. It's good. We listen to it from here." I'm like, see, this is what happens. Americans want to listen to a Telugu podcast. I want to see if Indians also want to listen to it as well. But okay, so I'm also going to answer this. I actually listen to something called the Happiness Lab a lot. I discovered it recently, but it's really nice. I'm actually even doing a course by the host. She teaches in Yale, and she has a Science of Wellness course which you can just do online. It's for free actually, and you can get certified and all that stuff. So it's basically, she's a psychology professor and she just talks about the science of happiness, and it's a lovely one to listen to because she goes to like ancient philosophy, she goes present day. It's really fun. I mean, it's a fun podcast, but it's around something you can kind of learn about. That's my recent discovery. Also recent discovery, best podcast name ever is a podcast I found called Metaphysical Milkshake. I'm like, that's a name you will never like. It's the most bizarre name. It's called Metaphysical Milkshake. Show's okay. The name's really nice. But if I do another one, I would actually do music. I do talk plus music. One little known fact about me is the amount of music I listen to. This is when this whole thing came out, one of my first messages went around saying, okay, what can I do? Because that's something I've been doing. I've been creating when there were mixtapes, when there were things like that. I've been doing those things for the longest time. I literally just sent my sister who lives in the UK a playlist because she asked me to make a playlist and send her. So yes, I would do something around music. Awesome. So it's been fun. I don't think I've done a double header podcast ever, and it's been a lot of fun to do this. Thanks Arjun for coming on. Thanks Yogi and Kabeer. Thanks Sarthak.
Yeah, we call it 69.
इसको कट नहीं करना.
ये कुछ भी कट नहीं होता है podcast पे. The good part about this podcast is nothing ever gets cut. And also weirdly, if anyone's watching this on video, the fact that we have Sarthak here and Arjun has a blurred background and we always see some form walking behind him throughout this recording is the most entertaining thing I've ever
Just
had.
a dog, guys. Just a dog. Yeah.
So thank you a ton, guys. Thanks a ton for coming on Advertising Instead. It's been a lot of fun, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Varun.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Lovely meeting you, Arjun and Sarthak.
IVM